Good evening. And I'm Merle Wilberding, and I'm not Gilbert King. I saw this sign up here, but that's not me. I'm Merle Wilberding, one of the trustees of the Dayton Literary Peace Prize Foundation, and it's a pleasure to welcome everyone here tonight. This is a special night, and we're very happy to have everyone here. As you know, the Dayton Literary Peace Prize Foundation is a nonprofit, all-volunteer organization that's devoted to bringing the printed word to bring peace to the world. So it's a wonderful place for us. It's a wonderful place for you. And this is our 12th year, and oh, how we've grown. We've grown not only among our supporters, but among our honorees, and we've really become a large family, and it's been a wonderful experience as we've grown together. It's become a special part of our own lives, and I think it's become a special part of everyone's lives here. It's a wonderful opportunity. So thank you all for coming. The first I want to introduce Provost Paul Benson from the University of Dayton to give a formal welcome. Paul.
Good evening, everyone. This really won't be a very formal welcome. I simply wanted, on behalf of the university, to celebrate the presence that all of you have here, celebrate the writers who have returned, the new award winners, and really underscore the fact that for the University of Dayton, founded in part on a commitment to education for service, justice, and peace, our relationship with the Dayton Literary Peace Prize since its beginning has been extremely precious to us. It's of great value to us, tremendous value to this community. I've overheard tonight so many people say this is their favorite weekend in Dayton of the year. And I think for many of us, especially this year, a prize devoted to the cause of peace across the human family has particular meaning for all of us. And we celebrate that tonight. So thanks again for being here. And Sharon, are you up next? Merle's back up? Okay. That shows how much I know. I'll return the podium to Merle Wilberding. Please enjoy the evening.
I told Paul I had his back. He just didn't realize I was right back of him. So, thank you. And one of the reasons we're here tonight is to recognize and thank the patrons. And we have wonderful patrons of this organization. We've had individual patrons who supported us from the start of the Dayton Literary Peace Prize. We've had a number of companies and institutions of higher institution that have been loyal for us for the 12 years. And this year we've had a lot of new companies that have joined us in their support. And we want to thank all of them. They're listed in our website, but meanwhile, let's give them a hand of applause. I have a few special guests I'm going to leave to Gilbert King to introduce the panel, but I'll identify a couple of people. First, I see Christopher Cerf and Catherine Vaz here. Would you stand? They've been a wonderful part of the family. Been here most years. Happy to have you back this year. It's a great opportunity. We enjoy it and look forward to the whole weekend with you. We also have Gilbert King's wife, Lorna King. I saw her earlier. Where is she? There she is. Thank you for joining us. And then I want to introduce the remaining trustees of the Dayton Literary Peace Prize. Doris Ponitz, who is not well and not here tonight, but we wish her well and think of her as this evening. It was one of her favorite evenings. We also have Tom Lasley. Where's Tom? There he is. Our new trustee, Sherry Shuden. And one of our co-chairs, Mark Meister. And our co-chair and director, Sharon Rabb. And Sharon, would you come on up? And I've got your back, too.
Okay. You know how the vertigo goes. Okay. Hi. Thank you for coming. This is wonderful to look out here and see all of you. The first year, maybe that many people came. So it's terrific to see all of you. I wanted to talk about a couple things that you have participated in. One of them is our Fly with the Doves circle. And for those new people here, we started a program that is a membership. It's an annual membership, and people become a member of the Fly with the Doves circle. And with that money that comes in, we buy winning books for libraries and schools. And our first recipient was the library in Sarajevo that was burned during the war. And we are shipping our first 62 books to them. We had the book plates translated into Bosnian, which wasn't easy. And we are going to be placed, all the books are going to be placed in the American corner of the National Library. So, thank you. And so we're hoping you will continue to donate to that, and you donate online. It's relatively simple. And I want to talk to you about Monday night. I want to talk to you about an opportunity on Monday night. On Monday night, and we have very few tickets left, but should you be interested, there are a few tickets left. We're doing a screening of Brooklyn, Colm Tóibín's film, and Colm's going to be there. And he's going to be talking about this. So you can also get tickets to that online. There's a button that you push, okay? And then you have to put your numbers in, that kind of thing. So there's one other thing that I want to talk to you about. We have a 2020 plan. Every business in town has a 2020 plan because it sounds so good, like it's got the vision and it's got the numbers. And so we did it too. And one of the things that we are looking for is a way to create the sustainability that's going to continue to build this program and make sure that it's going to be in Dayton forever. And one of our board members was new and said, she said, well, should I give $20,000 by 2020? And I said, yes. And so when she said that, another one of the board members said, well, I can do that too. And I go, great. Wasn't even part of the plan. But it seems like such a good idea. So I'm going to protect their names because they're wealthy. And I'm going to say, if any of you would like to donate to the 2020 plan, it doesn't have to be $20,000 by 2020. And we will take whatever you would like to give. But it will go into our sustainability fund, which will be very important for us to continue all of this. So thank you for what you have given. Thank you for what you're thinking about giving. And we'll see you later, okay?
Okay, thanks, Sharon. Sharon whispered on the way out that she would take 30,000 if you can't do the 20,000, so I think that'll be okay. Our moderator tonight is Gilbert King. Gilbert King, most of you know, he was the 2013 runner-up for Nonfiction for his book Devil in the Grove. Wonderful book. I actually reread it again this spring, and it was just staggering to read about it. And talking with Gilbert at dinner last night, we were talking about this is not only a book about history, but it's a book about living history because a number of the people that are in the book are still alive. And it's just staggering to think how close and how near the events of that covered in that book are actually in our own life system. So Gilbert's our man. He's been a wonderful friend of the Dayton Literary Peace Prize. He's got perfect attendance ever since. So we really appreciate it. Gilbert, the panel is all yours.
Put that back there. Oh, it's not working. First of all, I just want to say, as always, it's so great to be back here. I didn't know there was an attendance record that was being kept, official. All right, we'll take it. We're going to get right to it, because I know that you really came here to hear these brilliant authors speak, and so we're going to get right into it. But I just want to say one thing. We have a microphone set up. Is that right? Do we have that somewhere? Yeah. 2 microphones set up. After I ask some professional questions, you people can ask your little questions and try not to bore us too much. No, seriously, you guys actually ask much better questions. So we'll do that, but make sure you go to the microphone because this is being recorded. And they're bringing the microphone to them. Okay, that's even better. So you can sit where you are. I'm going to just start out by going with the questions and sort of briefly introduce who we have here. But I'll start it out with a question first. So I think a lot of us writers are constantly asked, "What's your book about?" And it's a very difficult question to answer, especially for novelists. I've seen novelists struggle with this question. Imagine if we had like Franz Kafka sitting here and his answer was, "It's about a salesman who turns into a bug." Not too many Kindle downloads that evening. But so we here at Dayton are sophisticated readers, so we're going to talk more about themes here. And so my first question, and I'll go down the line, is going to be, what is it in your work, the themes that you're working with, because these are very important themes, peace, social justice, what is it about your work and the themes of your work that you discovered in your writing that surprised you or enlightened you? And so we'll start with Colm, since he is the Richard Holbrooke Lifetime Achievement Award recipient. I suppose, Colm, you can go back as far as you want with that award. Like if there's an essay in primary school that you were particularly proud of, you can talk about that theme. But we'll just start it with you. Is there anything in your latest book or any book that you could sort of relate to the Dayton Literary Peace Prize, a theme that sort of surprised you and enlightened you as you were doing your research?
In 1996, I published a novel called The Story of the Night, which arose from the time I spent in Buenos Aires in the aftermath of the war, in the aftermath of the general's rule of the dictatorship, where I attended the trial of Galtieri and the other generals. And I sat in the courtroom. The court started about 3 in the afternoon, often went on until after midnight. And all of the people who had survived the torture chambers and the prisons gave evidence. And sometimes one or two of the torturers arrived and in a very odd way gave evidence. And I sat there day in, day out listening to this. And it was genuinely shocking because it had happened in the very streets outside, and that the entire society had pretended they didn't know it was happening. Obviously, there was not a free press, so the only journalist reporting on it was Ukigonyi in the Buenos Aires Herald in English. But the Spanish press in Buenos Aires could not and did not report on it. And many journalists were in great danger if they even hinted at it. But what was extraordinary was that everywhere I went, people said, that trial you're attending is a waste of money. that you know, the last thing we need, our economy is in such a bad state. Things are so bad here. And what are you guys doing? You're all coming down here to witness the worst time. We don't want to know about it. A lot of it didn't even happen, and people were in full denial. And it was a strange period. I'm talking about, this is 1985, into 1986, into 1987. Later on, I went and wrote about Maradona, the soccer player. And just as an extra question to each player or to each trainer or to manager, I'd say, what do you think of the fact that 20,000 people disappeared in your country just a few years ago? And they said, no, it's nothing to do with me. I wasn't involved. I didn't really know anybody who disappeared. And for a novelist, it was never for me the story of what happened in the torture chambers or how people were murdered that interested me. It was the silence, it was the denial, it was the aftermath, it was the period when all the information was now freely available and people were still living as though it had not occurred. The information was slowly seeping into the public domain. And that, for me, that the aftermath is the period where the novelist can work, rather than the moment where I still feel that in a time of great tension, that journalists are perhaps the people we need most to tell us exactly what is happening. But in the time after, and about the time after, a novelist can find characters who are both inside and outside the story, living in the silence and living in the shame surrounding silence, and that a novelist can explore that material in a way that is quite different to the way any other writer can explore it. So I suppose that is one example of how I work and how I see the relationship between what I do and public events, or the creation of harmony, or the writing about times of when we humans are at our very worst. That my intervention comes later.
Wow, excellent. Want me to keep going, David, or you want to? Go right ahead. All right. David Wood, this year's winner for nonfiction. This is his first time to Dayton. David, do you want to explore that theme, or anything you want to talk about with moral injury?
I think I remember the first part of your question. So I'm a journalist, and one of the things that we learn in journalism is to design what we call a nut graph, which is a very, very spare description of what it is that you're writing. And so whether it's a news story or a book, the nut graph is really critical, and it's the first thing that I do when I sit down to write something is, what is this really about? So the nut graph for my book about moral injury is, we send kids to war and bad stuff happens. That's it. So if that answers your question about theme, that's the theme.
And was there anything that surprised you in your research that maybe you didn't know going into this project?
Yeah, the thing that surprised me was the willingness of people who'd been through really bad experiences to talk about it, and their ability to articulate the pain that they felt going through those experiences and then carrying that pain back from war on into their civilian lives. I often jokingly say that that the kids that we send to war, the young Marines and soldiers and airmen and sailors, don't come out of a tradition of where being articulate about your innermost feelings is really appreciated, to say the least. If you spend any time at Marine boot camp, you'll find that Marines talk usually in single-syllable words, and usually not words that are printable. But what really surprised me in really drilling down into their lives was, again, how articulate they were about their experiences. And so I hope I've reflected that honestly and generously in the book.
Excellent. Susan, do you want to, okay. Susan, you write about a different kind of war coverage. Your book, you were last year's runner-up for nonfiction, a book about Nagasaki. Winner, I'm sorry. I know you won. Talking about Nagasaki, a different war from 60 years ago. Anything that surprised you, even if it's after you've written the book? They're doing a documentary on Susan right now in Japan. And so is there maybe something that occurred to you in your research, in your writing, or even after your book came out, something that surprised you or enlightened you?
I'd say everything surprised me because I didn't know what I got myself into. However, I think that, so my book is about the survivors of the Nagasaki atomic bombing and the enduring effects of nuclear war on them and their city over 70 years. And so there's that very obvious theme, but do you say Colm? Is that how you say your name? The way Colm was talking, so there's that story, but there's an underlying, or a number of underlying themes that ended up being very deep motivating factors that are for continuing and finishing the book, which had to do with the silencing, the denial, the manipulation of the truth about the atomic bombings, but particularly about Nagasaki, the rationalization in our country of such a heinous act of the mass annihilation of so many innocent people, and so that kept evolving as I went. They're like secondary themes in the book, but they were intense. And in the aftermath, it didn't surprise me because I have talked with many people who are still really passionately believe in the story that we have learned, that the bomb, singular, ended the war and saved 1 million American lives. But I have still been shaken by some of the vitriolic questions and comments that come via email or in person in lectures and talks that I give.
Wow. Interesting. Andrew Krivak, past winner. Andrew, what year did you?
2012.
2012, okay. And he's back to present this year as well. And he has a new book out called The Signal Flame, a new novel. You want to talk about Signal Flame, if people who are not familiar with that book?
Well, actually, your question is fascinating, and I have been thinking about this for a long time. I don't think I really started to write seriously until my father passed away. And the notion of loss just struck me so profoundly, that vertiginous place where you stand on the cliff of something and gaze into nothing. And that just kept me thinking for a long, long time. And the only way in which I could somehow, even in my Catholic imagination, somehow justify this was to think about the small act. The small act is that one thing we can do which is even remotely, possibly redemptive. And so, speaking of The Sojourn, the book that was awarded the Dayton Literary Peace Prize for fiction, that book became a sort of meditation on the small act in the midst of this great war. And so I continue to just try to write about that. And The Signal Flame, I think that persists, perhaps less so because war is completely off stage, but now it's the small act within the family, within the home. And I just continue to think about that. And loss. If you think about it, we inherit loss. And the one thing we will leave behind is somebody feeling our sense of loss, or a sense of loss for our having left this world. That's it's right up there with taxes that we have to do. And so that just fascinates me that's we are the inheritors of loss.
That's excellent, thank you. Viet Nguyen, who was last year's winner for his brilliant novel, Sympathizer. I think since then you've been a little bit busy. Since last year, you have a new collection of short stories. Was just recently awarded the MacArthur Fellowship, the Genius Award. So, Viet, if you want to apply my question to the book of short stories, feel free.
Sure. So The Refugees came out this year, but it was actually a collection of short stories that I wrote over 20 years of pain and agony, basically. But I actually wrote it before The Sympathizer in another book that came out in 2016 called Nothing Ever Dies. And in writing The Refugees, I was learning how to write, and I think like many young writers, at least for me, what I thought I was dealing with was working with the humanity of refugees. It's a collection of short stories about Vietnamese refugees and the people they encounter. And certainly growing up as a Vietnamese refugee in this country, I thought, Americans and people the world over don't really have a grasp of the humanity of Vietnamese people, especially if all they're getting from them, about them, is Hollywood movies. So there seemed to be a real urgency to write stories about humanizing Vietnamese people and giving them a voice. And that was my project for 15 or 20 years. And then after I finished that, I thought, maybe there's a problem with that. And it was really hard to come to that realization, because obviously if you're dealing with peace, there's this inclination that of course we want to understand other people's humanity, of course we want to hear the voices of people we haven't heard before, but perhaps there's also a layer of sentimentality to that as well. And for all that we've desired to understand other people's humanity and to hear their voices, it hasn't really stopped us from going to war. So then I wrote The Sympathizer and Nothing Ever Dies, and those are a little bit more darker works, because I realized maybe what I really also have to understand besides humanity and voice is inhumanity and voicelessness. Why are people rendered voiceless? How can we hear people who don't get to speak? And how can we confront the inhumanity, not of our enemies, which is always easy to see, but the inhumanity within us and the inhumanity of the people that we consider to be on our side and our kin and our family, our relatives. That's a hard project, but I think that for me, the realization around peace was that we're never going to be able to get to peace until we're actually able to confront this inhumanity within us, as well as our potential for humanity as well.
Viet, can I just have a follow-up?
Oh, yeah, sure.
How has life changed when you're recognized as a genius?
I don't know. No, I mean, everybody says it very sarcastically. Oh. So if they, once they actually say it genuinely, maybe I can tell you right now.
James Hannaham, last year's runner-up for fiction. This is your second year, New York City guy. You want to expand on any, whether it's want to talk about a work in progress, or you can go back and address your last book, which everybody loves.
I'm certainly not going to talk about a work in progress.
People love that.
You know how to ask the hard questions. So when I hear the word theme, I always think of children writing what they did over the summer, and it kind of gets my dander up to think I try not to think about theme. I think this is a pretty common thing with a lot of novelists. We don't try to think about theme as we're writing. I just try to think about people and how to represent, how to turn this, which is, life, into words on a page. And the slippery way in which people don't seem to understand that there's a difference sometimes between this and words on a page. And that a lot of the time it has to do with the person writing. But I think I can say that when I discovered, or I read a story, in a nonfiction book, about a black woman in Florida who was enslaved in the modern sense and not in the old-timey sense in 1992. I think a lot of things happened in my mind at that moment. I mean, that was a big surprise. And that said to me, oh, well, what the hell is time? The same thing is happening to the same demographic in the same place. Is there such a thing as moving beyond anything? The whole Faulkner chestnut comes to mind, the time, the past isn't even past. And it also seemed to me that in just about every conversation I'd ever heard about slavery in this country, the discussion was about the slavery of the past, and there was no connection for me between the slavery of the past and the slavery that's happening. I don't know. I mean, I live in New York, and it's there's probably people in a sweatshop just a couple of subway stops away from my house, right? And I know there's actually a sort of great website called slaverymap.org that will show you all of the different places in which human trafficking cases have been tried. So it's not like a speculative thing. It's these are things that have actually been prosecuted. But of course, there are tons of them that have never been tried. And it's gotten a little bit easier, I think, to prosecute these cases. But a lot of the time, there just wasn't, the laws weren't there. And that's a sort of disturbing thing to me. So when I was hearing Colm talk about silence, I was thinking about, well, what about the silence of now? I mean, I think there's plenty of silence going on that in this country especially, and maybe that's a theme that everyone is sort of dealing with. I feel like with Viet's work, there's a silence around the humanity of Vietnamese people, as if that was a negotiable thing, And with me, I was just like, well, nobody's talking about this. I had never had a conversation with people of color about this particular, this particular issue in the way that I wanted to see it put out into the world. And so I felt like I had this sort of task of an attempt to change the conversation about slavery and say to people, well, if I'm supposed to get over it, well, why can't it end?
Excellent. Patricia Engel, this year's winner for fiction. Patricia, I'm sure you weren't surprised to hear Florida mentioned with some kind of injustice that James just mentioned, but you're from Florida. Just talk about themes yourself.
Similar to James, theme is something that I come to later in the writing, and with the veins of the ocean, and it's present a little bit in my first book, Vita. What I really wanted to explore were the lives, the inner workings of families of prisoners, of inmates. In the case of the veins of the ocean, the prisoner is on death row for a heinous crime. There's no question of his guilt. He's not especially remorseful. He's not a particularly heartwarming type of criminal. And I really wanted to explore how family members have to reconcile the fact that they love somebody who has done something so terrible that society has deemed them unfit for living. And I was interested in the complexities between love and forgiveness and justice and compassion, and how one lives with that. And how, and especially in families where trauma, there's a legacy of trauma, an inheritance of trauma. How does one overcome all of that in order to sustain the love for somebody that you have known since birth, perhaps? So it began with that, the exploration of prison families, which is something that's interested me. Also, it's set in Florida, which has a very unique prison system. To say the least. And I was really caught up in that, and the story began from that place, and then it grew into a story about captivity and the prisons that we all live in, personal and institutionalized, and geographic and emotional exiles, and the way that one must forgive themselves and is somehow sometimes unable to do that.
Great. I think most writers will say that they really do stand on the shoulders of giants, and they really are inspired by people, whether it's writers or just people in general that inspired their work. So with that in mind, I guess I would just like to go down the row again and just ask the writers to inform us who inspired them, whether it's another writer from the past or maybe just someone in their research that they found particularly inspiring, that they thought this person might be worth writing about or knowing their story. And we'll start again with you, Colm.
I suppose I'd go back to silence to say name, people, I know I come from a very rich literary tradition, but if you try and name an Irish writer in the 19th century or in the 18th century, just think off the top of your head, who would you name? And when I recently, the census forms from 1901 and 1911 have appeared online from Ireland, so you can, without any charge, you can just go through, you can see the actual census form. I found my mother's grandfather, and there they all were, and then, but it was only when I looked at the bottom, I saw, and this was 1911, I saw the X. He was illiterate. In the British Empire, and that he was illiterate, and so that silence, that idea, that goes into the next generation, where my father's brother would have been a much better writer than I would ever have been. We just didn't get a chance, and my mother certainly would have wanted that for herself and didn't get the chance. So that idea of coming out of a tradition which is filled with noise, filled with Joyce and Yeats and Beckett, but it's also filled with the strange figures who didn't get the chance, who wrote X, but who were probably great talkers, or who just sat there thinking about all the opportunities they were missing, or planning a revolution, or even just sitting there planning nothing much, just filled with resentment. That matters maybe more than Henry James matters, but he matters too.
Great answer. And David, you can tackle that, and I imagine it wouldn't be just writers that you'd be drawing from, maybe just people's stories of survival and coping.
So I've always been captivated by stories, and I remember growing up reading the New York Herald Tribune and discovering something called the New Journalism, which rejected the idea of writing sort of linear news stories and instead told stories, real stories, narrative stories. And so I think that's where I got my first inspiration. And later on, I came across the work of John McPhee, who I absolutely idolize and have shamelessly copied, right down to his habit of keeping a file of index cards on which he jotted ideas and themes and characters and things, quotes, and then arranged them. So when I wrote this book, What Have We Done, I did that. It worked okay. There were some, so I had it arranged by chapters, and there were some chapters that were empty, and particularly the last one, which was called Conclusion. And that stayed empty for a long time, and I kept going to back to John McPhee for inspiration. So thank you, John McPhee.
That's great. Susan, go right ahead.
So my day job over the last 30 years, I'm in the field of theater and social change, and I have a professional company in Arizona. And so I stand on the shoulders of the artists at Living Stage in Washington, D.C., which no longer exists, one of the best, most amazing theater company ever, where I studied for many, many years. And on the hundreds of thousands of stories of the marginalized people in Arizona whose stories we have heard and brought to life over the last 28 years. As a writer, I'm not too happy, as you asked the question, to realize that all of the writers who inspire me are men. They're not all the writers that inspire me are men, but the ones who inspired me specifically for Nagasaki were men. Howard Zinn, John Dower, the historian, whose work I adore, and James Baldwin.
Go ahead, Andrew.
Yeah, so I grew up in a part of northeastern Pennsylvania in the 70s. That was pretty tough, and I was bullied for wanting to read books and be smart, and often had to fight physically to keep my books, and frequently was the loser of those fights. But on the flip side of that, my grandmother, my mom's mother, lived up the street from us, and she told these stories in Slovak, and my mother had to translate a great deal of them that were just like unbelievable about the old country. She suffered deeply in the old country during the Great War, and then prior to that and during the Great War. So there's that component of struggle in there, but I have to say the other, with respect to influence, was just poetry for me. I just loved poetry. And it wasn't really until I was an undergrad and reading classics that I encountered Homer, like in the original language, and I couldn't have read that in Dallas, Pennsylvania, Homer. But reading Homer, and I still have lines from Book 12 of the Odyssey in my head. Hey, men stén upon anapleo men gohantes. And John Berryman, Sonnet 43. Listen now, for poets are fain to lie, and I for you a liar am 1,000 times. Scars of these months blazon like a decree, and I would have you, a liner pulls the sky. Trust when I remember thee. Then gin and limes, you are cooler, darling. Oh, come back to me.
Wow.
That's always in my head when I sit down to write a sentence.
Impressive. Thank you. Thank you, Andrew. Viet?
Well, I could probably name any number of famous writers that people in this room have heard of who have been influential for me. So for example, if you've read Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man and then you read the opening paragraph of The Sympathizer, you'll clearly see these kinds of resonances. So there's many kinds of those kinds of influences on my work, but I think about also literary traditions and collective efforts and the building of traditions, and the fact that as lonely as it is to be a writer for any of us, I think back to the first Asian American or Asian immigrant writers who were writing in English in this country in the late 19th century, and they were really lonely. Because they weren't just lonely as individual writers, but they were trying to do something that the rest of the country had no comprehension about. So I could mention the names of Onoda Watana and Sui Sin Far, which were the pen names of two sisters, Edith and Winifred Eaton, half Chinese and half English. And they were the first ones writing books that were published in English. And then more than 100 years later, someone like me can come along, and I can safely assume that as problematic as the categories of being a Vietnamese American writer or an Asian American writer might be, these are still categories. People still know what that is. New York publishers will say, oh, we can sell this in this category. And you're not so alone anymore because you have Asian American writers collectives and Vietnamese American writers collectives that help to enable people like me. But that's the culmination of decades, of more than a century, of individual writers writing in anonymity or in obscurity, and the political movements and social movements that help to create the space for someone like me to come along and to have immediate recognition that someone like me can exist. So I think it's crucial to acknowledge those kinds of writers that many of which have been forgotten or unknown, like Carlos Bulosan and John Okada and writers like that.
James, go right ahead.
I'm going to answer this question entirely personally, rather than showing my hand about who I rip off. Just read it. You'll see who I'm ripping off, or not, and that's fine. But in a personal sense, Jennifer Egan has been a person who's been. I had the very good fortune to show her long before lots of things, the kinds of things that are happening in her career were happening now. Were happening in like 1995. She read one of the first things I had attempted to write, and she inspired me to keep going because she marked it up like crazy, which I assumed meant that it was good, but probably meant that it was actually quite terrible. And just the other day, she wrote me a recommendation for something. So I was just like, she's been like my surrogate mother, and I owe her pretty much my firstborn child. Although she has two of her own, I'm sure she wouldn't want one more. The second person I'll mention is Jean Genet, because I'm not sure whether this story is actually true, but when he was writing one of his novels, he was in prison. I think it was Our Lady of the Flowers, and he had written pretty much the whole thing, and then the prison guards confiscated it and destroyed it. So he rewrote it entirely on like a scrap of toilet paper, and that always makes me feel like a total wuss. And so when I remember that, I'm like, just shut up and do your work, Right. And then the third person I'll mention is a friend of mine whose name is Bob Smith. He was a comedian. He was one of the first openly gay comedians to appear on network television. I think the first to appear on the Johnny Carson show. And he got ALS, and he's had it for about 7 or 8 years, I think. It might even be longer. But he hasn't allowed it to stop him. He wrote a memoir even as he was losing the ability to move his body. And that, I thought, I'll give up when that guy gives up.
Great. And Patricia?
I was fortunate in that I grew up in a family with a lot of artists, painters and musicians, but none of them who were lucky enough to do it full time as their main source of income. So I grew up seeing people who were devoted to their art, regardless of whether they were being recognized for it or having any success from it. They just did it because they were artists in their hearts, and they had that discipline. So I had the example of discipline for art, whichever art, from very early on. But my greatest influence was my grandmother, who was the writer of the family. She never published anything, but she wrote 13 books, which she never showed anybody. They were locked up in cases in her basement, and she had 9 children. And somehow she found the time to write not only these volumes, but these epic letters to everybody that she left behind in Colombia when she came to the United States, to her dozen or so grandchildren, to her 9 children, their spouses, all her friends from church, everybody. And these are the letters that everybody kept. And I just came back from Colombia, and she also wrote poems. I just came back from Colombia where a cousin gave me a whole stack of poems that she had sent her that nobody else had seen. So she wrote and wrote and wrote just because it was part of her. She could not write. So I understood that I was like that I would write no matter what I was doing. And it was only until much, much, much later that I had any sense of that publishing was something that somebody could pursue. So I started writing like that, always for myself, and I still write like that, or try to write like that. And I always think of her because, of course, she devoted her life to her family, and she never had the luck to be able to pursue her passion in the way that I've been able to do. So I think of her and all the other women who came before me in my family who also gave up their lives for the livelihood of their own families, and they're the ones that keep me writing.
Great. And I'll just add something just because there's a segment of the population that doesn't get a lot of shout outs, but I personally am inspired in the work that I do by lawyers. These lawyers, yeah, there we go. The lawyers I'm generally writing about are taking on these dangerous cases in the 40s and the 50s in the Deep South. If they're black, they have nothing but their education. They're paid with fruit and chickens, and they're the voice for the voiceless. I find those stories particularly inspiring. Even if they're white, they're sometimes facing community blowback. How can you dare take on these cases? You're not representing your race by taking on these cases. And so they face a tremendous amount of backlash in their communities, and yet they're believing in something. It's the Constitution and the power of law and what America stands for. And so a little shout out to the lawyers. I guess I'm gonna, I'll ask one more question and then we'll go to the audience, because I find that last time we had great let questions and I wish we could have let it go longer. But I will answer ask this question of our panelists again. We all go to some pretty dark places if we're here in Dayton for our books. There's just no doubt about it. I mean, granted, there's a lot of times there's a rainbow at the end, but sometimes they're very dark places. And I guess I just want to ask authors, because I'm really curious, when you do these kind of stories, whether they're set in the past or the present, do you see much hope for the future? Or do you see us repeating these same kind of stories that will, find themselves repeating again and not learning from this history? Colm, we'll start with you again.
Oh, that's the big question. It's too big for me. I'm just a poor novelist. This business of finding that you open the newspaper again, and here it comes again, the genocide. Here it comes again, the single brutal murder. Here it comes again, the irrational hatred. Here it comes again, the war that won't end. Here it comes again, the empire that insists on inflicting itself on smaller countries. Here it comes again, and so you have to say, I mean, you mentioned Kafka, that I know this is wrong, he shouldn't have said this, he shouldn't have said so many things that he said that were so wrong of him. When he said, oh, plenty of hope, oh, hope, yes, all hope, none for us.
That's great. That's great. And David and Susan especially, this question is very difficult, but especially when we're dealing with the real present day dangers, I guess you might say. But David.
After I finished writing about moral injury of the young men and women we sent to war, I did go into kind of a depression, thinking this is never going to end, because every time that we start a war somewhere, we never seem to finish it. And it goes on and on. Just yesterday, we were dropping bombs in Somalia. You know, I went to Somalia with Marines in 1992. We're still there, and it's infuriating. So I've started a new book. It's called Finishing War, and where I find hope is among the people that I'm beginning to meet who are, I hate this word, but peace builders. For example, there are people in Iraq, Iraqis, who are training neighborhood mediators in places like Mosul. So that, for example, in Mosul, where you have people who've been displaced, who fled the fighting, who are coming back to find that their house is now occupied by somebody else. You have Shia and Sunni. You have Shia sub-tribes and Sunni sub-tribes, all of whom are jockeying for position and power and revenge. The place is a madhouse of boiling hot emotion. So that the idea of training neighborhood mediators and spreading them out through the city is a phenomenally hopeful idea. So that kind of stuff is going on. And that does give me some hope against the awful, awful drumbeat of repeated war and our mad determination to try to pursue our national interest by dropping bombs on people. You know, it's crazy.
Susan, we really haven't talked about nuclear weapons for a long time, and yet it's come up again.
What do you mean we haven't talked about it?
Well, I'm talking about North Korea.
As
You
a
see
country, you mean? We
Right.
haven't-
It's
yeah.
sort of been a little bit off the table.
Yeah, we've just been building up our arsenal
Right.
quietly. I mean, at a very deep personal level, I am absolutely hopeless, and I am also hopeful. I'm kind of split in two, because I honestly don't see hope. I mean, certainly, with the current administration and the flinging of rhetoric about the use of nuclear weapons is enough to, at least for someone like me who spent 12 years living the stories of nuclear survival and death, it's very shaking to my core. And at the same time, look who just won the Nobel Peace Prize, the international campaign to abolish against nuclear weapons is what it's called, and it's called ICAN, and that organization led the movement over many, many years of effort to negotiate a nuclear weapons ban treaty with the United Nations that was adopted this year. Of course, none of the nuclear-armed nations have signed and will not sign, but you have to start somewhere, and this was a huge accomplishment. So I have a lot of faith in hope in individuals and in groups, and when I come here, I come away filled with strength and hope and courage, which I'm very grateful for.
Andrew, the triumph of the human spirit is going to happen, right?
I want to believe there's hope, but I just, there are days when I feel like philosophically as a Stoic, we can only act out of our own self, and that could be to affect great change in the world. And looking at children, my children, everyone, anyone's children, I think that has to be a place of hope. So to boil it down, I go back to what I said in the beginning, was that if there is to be hope, I think it would only be visual or be seen or affected in some small, good, act, that's all I can believe, the small act. That could perhaps be the best or the most significant move.
Viet?
Honestly, I've actually never found myself in a situation where I'm the most hopeful person in the room. It takes a room full of writers to be really depressing. Well, you know, I go back to that answer that I had too about humanity and inhumanity, that these things are actually inextricable within us, you know, as people, but also as civilizations that are completely capable of what we could call savagery or barbarism. But at the same time, you know, the optimistic part of me looks back at history and thinks, you go back a few thousand years, and people were killing each other because they lived in a different village or lived in a different city-state. And now we think, oh, you know, we only kill people who live in a different nation-state. You know, New Yorkers and Los Angelinos aren't going to kill each other, hopefully. So that's progress, right? I mean, that's a sense of that's a sense of an expansion, right? The idea that yes, it's supposedly a human tendency to love only those of us who are love those who are near and dear to us, and cast out those who are far and feared. But we've been working collectively, individually, to try to expand that definition of the near and the dear, to expand that circumference ever wider. And of course, that runs up into hard realities like nuclear weapons. You know, so we have the capacity to imagine a more hopeful future, to build peace. We also have the capacity to blow ourselves up. And that's how we've always been. Except now we have a greater philosophical scale of trying to imagine that greater humanity, and we have a greater capacity for destruction at the same time. I guess I wasn't so hopeful after all.
Well, if a genius says there's hope, then there's hope. James?
I am a dark place.
Wow.
I'm actually full of hope. I'm not in denial of the realities of the world and all the darkness that lives within each of us, but I'm full of hope, even on my worst days, I think, because living without hope seems like such a scary and lonely alternative. I see miracles and acts of kindness that just fill me with light and peace every single day, and I have to believe that those are a thread to something larger. I agree with Viet completely that we've always been this very complicated and dangerous species towards one another, but I think we also have a capacity for extraordinary goodness, and I think that hope is our only means of survival.
Let's open it up to the crowd, the real readers here, and see if anybody wants to start with the questioning. Question's right behind us. Okay.
So we hear the silence. The silence is that tipping point in any crucial situation. What have we learned that, I mean, I know that creatives tend to create that reaching out to the people that are afraid to speak out, that are afraid to say what they know is wrong. Are there any lessons that any of you have picked up in these previous struggles where creatives or just common people have created a safe environment or started that safe environment to create that bridge between the people that are in silence and what they want to say?
Excellent. Anybody want to tackle that one?
Well, I just since I was so down on hope, I just should really, I mean, in Ireland, we had the figure of John Hume, who just kept saying the same thing over and over. People used to laugh at him, but he would just say it in the same sincere look on his face. His eyes would water with conviction as he would say, "There is no such thing as territory, there are only people. You do not make friends with your friends, you make friends with your enemies." And eventually, he actually forced the IRA to come to the table. And David Trimble and people on the unionist side were forced by the presence of John Hume to do this. And we were lucky that we had, oddly enough, someone who's demonized regularly now. Tony Blair did his best. Bill Clinton, who I don't hear good things about either, was on the phone day and night about this. You know, the Irish Prime Minister, Bertie Ahern, who no one likes anymore, stayed up all night, night after night to do this, and that it was the last thing we expected, that after all these years, the intractable problem of Northern Ireland would at least settle. I mean, it hasn't fully settled, but it has settled to the extent, it's like putting a child down where at least the child isn't throwing things anymore. And that's the first thing. The second thing is, as a gay man in Ireland, it would have been, I mean, if someone had told me that we were going to be able to get married, I would have said, hey, listen, you're in some other planet. When we go to Mars, well, yeah, I'll get married in Mars. I'll get married on the moon. I'll get married in heaven. I'll get married in hell, limbo, But the idea, hold on, the Irish people are going to vote 65-35 for the right for you to get married. Get married to my girl? Oh, to your boyfriend? Oh, no. That won't happen, and it won't just happen in my lifetime. It just won't happen. The island is just too bigoted, too strange, too weird. Protestants, Catholics, they're just too bad. And then it happened. And it happened again because a group of people, just slowly came out early on, made the argument, softened opinions, brought people with them. And so there are two examples on my island of things that worked, things that seemed unimaginable, and things that have changed all our lives. So, yeah, so there is plenty of hope.
Does anybody want to build on what Colm just said, or should we go on to another question? Okay, we'll move on to another question. Sir, over here. Did you want to go? Go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to say
Go ahead. Susan's going to say something. Hold on.
I can't say, is it on?
Yeah. You're on.
I can't say that that this man built a community of safety or a sense of safety, but Gilbert mentioned that I've been participating in this documentary for 5 days straight of straight shooting, and Sharon got pulled over for 40 minutes in the middle of her big weekend yesterday to be on film yesterday. So the focus of this film is one of the survivors in my book. His name is Taniguchi Sumiteru, and his whole back was burned off when he was 16, and he was hospitalized eventually 3 months later, and lay on his stomach for almost 4 years before he was able to eventually move his legs and sit and then stand and then walk. And so in talking about him for the last 5 days very intensively on camera, I realized how he became one of Nagasaki's earliest anti-nuclear activists, and he was an activist until the day he died, which was just 2 months ago. And the perseverance against impossible odds when he should never have survived, and then when he should never have been able to fight for nuclear weapons, and then fighting against nuclear weapons when the whole world was building up huge arsenals, is an inspiration and a place of hope.
Vern, you had a question. We'll get a microphone over to you.
Susan, you and Patricia both spoke either now or at other times about times in your studying of women's prisons. And based on that, I'd like each of you to comment on whether you thought, speaking of hope, whether there's hope for people within the prisons, whether you saw anything within the prisons that you thought could provide hope for them.
Thank you. Would you like to go first?
Sure. Well, my work wasn't focused on women's prisons. Actually, in my novel, it's a male prisoner who's on death row. I had some experience with prison life prior to writing the novel, and I found that the people who love people in prison, whether they be family members or the people who become involved with inmates after their incarceration, are some of the most hopeful people that you'll ever meet. I also, in my research and just personal life and relationships, have known prisoners who've changed their lives in extraordinary ways after becoming incarcerated, who've been released and have gone on to contribute to society in extraordinary ways, and who've created beautiful art, who've gone into public service, who've gone into law, who've created beautiful families, raised wonderful children. So I think that prison, we've sort of been trained to view prisoners as the worst of our kind, and I think that the way that we view the prison system has to change. What we do with prison has to change. How we treat people who are in isolation has to change. But I think that prison can actually be a rebirth for many people.
Susan, go ahead.
So I'll say two things. One is, before the one is that I really agree with everything that you said, Patricia. So I directed a creative writing program for women in a federal prison outside Phoenix for 3 years. And I agree, the prison system was awful. I found it to be very difficult to be in, but the women were amazing. Out of the 28 years of these hundreds of thousands of people I've worked with, it was my favorite project of all. They were hungry for learning, they were falling out of their seats, wanting to learn, wanting to learn really serious writing skills. It wasn't just some vague thing, that we were working deeply into not only the telling of their stories, but the structure and the metaphors and the punctuation and how to write well. I think many of them went on to live strong and humble lives. Our theater company, our biggest project over the last, I think it's 18 years, is with juvenile sex offenders. And they're not in prison. They will if they don't complete their treatment program successfully. That's the next step, but this is a very serious, deep treatment program for these boys who are typically mostly 15, 16, 17. Sometimes they're as young as 11. And they're really, considered really, to be labeled a sex offender is one of the worst things you can be labeled, and to have done it too. And to see these young men, not all of them, but a large majority, work really hard to contend with the impact of their actions on not only their victims, but their families and themselves, is absolutely inspiring.
Great. We're going to go to Vern now because David is back. So, there we go.
Thank you. Yes, I had a question for David Wood. I love the premise of your book. I mean, man has understood from the beginning of violence and war that physical injury results. I think in the 20th century and now in our current time, we've appreciated to a greater extent the psychological injury of war. You've documented the moral injury that war in our present day contributes. I was just interested in the bio on the back of your, in the back flap of your book. It says that you are a birthright Quaker and raised as a pacifist, and you've spent more than 30 years covering the U.S. military and conflicts around the world. I wonder if you could just...
What's the question?
I wonder if you could explain to us what drew you to this field and how you reconciled your belief system with what you've witnessed as a professional throughout your life.
Sure. Well, I did grow up as a Quaker and was a conscientious objector and did 2 years of civilian service instead of going into the military during the Vietnam War. Then I became a journalist and in short order a foreign correspondent. I was sent to Africa and I was working for Time Magazine, and the story that Time Magazine wanted was about all the wars of national liberation that were sweeping across the continent. So Quaker Kid became a war correspondent, and it only occurred to me 20 years later, I probably should have had some training or preparation or special equipment. Now I've got body armor and helmets, and I carry trauma first aid kits and all that kind of stuff. But back then, I just kind of went. And through the kindness of strangers, got through that okay. I found the storytelling in war to be absolutely compelling. The stories of people who were caught up in war, the refugees, the suffering, people who fought wars, people who ended wars. It was all totally fascinating to me. And there was a certain amount of tension that I felt particularly when I spent a year with the Marine Battalion embedded, which meant I'd lived with them 24/7 for a year. And we went to Somalia, and there was a sergeant major in that Marine Battalion who I could tell hated me. I mean, first of all, to have a journalist there, he didn't like that. But a Quaker journalist and a war protester, and every once in a while I could see him sort of glaring at me out of the corner of his eye. And then one day we were on a long combat mission, which sort of went bad, and we took a pause, and he came striding over towards me over the ground, and I thought, uh-oh, here it comes from the sergeant major, and he said, "So I understand you were a conscientious objector." I said, "Yes, Sergeant Major, I was." "And you were out in the streets protesting the war when I was in Vietnam seeing all my friends die." I said, "Yes, Sergeant Major, I'm sorry, yes, I was." Long pause, and then he said, "That's where I should have been, out there protesting that damn war instead of fighting it." And that's when I could see this convergence between people who've been in combat and know what that's all about and can see the absolute futility of it, except for the individual acts of generosity and nobility and sacrifice and heroism. But collectively, that war is it's sort of where I started out, thinking, why would anybody go to war to try to solve the problems that we have? So I did come full circle. Thank you to the Sergeant Major.
Awesome. Has a question over there? Let's get a microphone over there. James, I think Awesome is going to crack you, and you're going to talk about your work in progress right here.
Oh, no, well, I don't know. I didn't have an agenda like that. But, okay, so this ceremony is about, it's called Dayton Literary Peace Prize, so it's about promoting peace through the written word. So that kind of implies like some kind of tangible, not necessarily, but some kind of good that comes from the work. And sometimes, yes, books do move me personally, but other times I read a book and I'm just like, okay. And
we don't have any of those books here today.
Yeah, but my question is, like, how do you feel confident that do you try to impact people in that way, and do you feel confident that your books do that? Do you feel galvanized to be galvanizing? And if so, how do you overcome that pressure?
Okay. Does anybody on the panel set out to write a book that impacts people, or why are you writing? I think that's part of the question. Anybody want to tackle that? James.
No, none of us really do that, I don't think. None of us have tried to impact anybody. No, I mean, I think it's quite evident that the opposite is true, right? I mean, wait, can you repeat the question exactly? Is that the entirety of the question?
No, I just sort of capsulized one of the things that he was talking about. And one of the things that was interesting to me is, like, I don't think anybody here sets out and say, I'm going to make an impact with this book.
Not out loud.
Right.
Yeah, but But when you write your book proposal and try to get the publisher to buy the book, you have to say that. So yeah, there is some intention. Would you, at least for nonfiction?
Yeah, I mean,
I guess you can't predict the impact, so
No.
you're telling a story, is what I'm saying,
Yeah,
but
yeah.
expand on it.
I think you're better if you're writing to work on your sentences and to make sure that, if you need a semicolon here, you and that if you get grandiose notions of yourself, that you're somehow or other Nelson Mandela in your cell, that someone should do something about this. However, we do have figures who have made a difference and figures who have been novelists who have done that. And it's not hard to think that a figure who was mentioned before here on the panel of James Baldwin continues from not only in the essays, but in a novel like Go Tell It on the Mountain or Another Country, or indeed Giovanni's Room, or If Beale Street Could Talk, have actually made a difference. They've created images that we recognize something we didn't know before fully. That somehow the movie was showing, but the room wasn't dark, and that he pulled the curtain so we could actually see for a second what was possible. And I think in the women's movement, it'd be very hard to imagine. I mean, not only the figure of Margaret Atwood at the moment, but the figure of someone like Doris Lessing, or indeed Nadine Gordimer in South Africa, that within the women's movement, I think it has made a real difference that there were women writing about women's lives in, say, the 60s, and not only writing essays, but writing fiction as well, that actually gave life to a movement that changed all our lives. So I think there are two things, but I think you're better just if it's you, just think, no, it's not going to be you. No one is ever going to stop doing something that we're about to do because of you. You just get on with, you just get on with the next sentence and just, don't make chocolate until you've finished the next paragraph.
but Colm, by the same token, you could also make the argument that why shouldn't it be you? I mean, really terrible novelists have also had a huge impact on the general public. I mean, the example I always think of is Harriet Beecher Stowe, who was accused of starting the Civil War by Abraham Lincoln himself. And that book is horrible. It's a terrible, terrible book. But it had a huge, huge influence. And part of it is just that it reached so many people. And it was so disgustingly sentimental that it actually made an impact. So, I mean, if Margaret Atwood, I would love for everyone to read Margaret Atwood and say, like, this changed my life, but I don't think that's everybody. Unfortunately, it might be somebody who's writing, it might be Stephanie Meyer.
Anybody else want to build on Oscar? Yeah, go ahead, Andrew.
So 4 years ago, Tim O'Brien at this very table said, "I don't write stories, I write sentences." And I think about that a lot. And I also, I really think your questions were really essential. But I want to say that I think there's a sort of essentialism in writing that we should avoid. That it somehow, well, not that it somehow matters, because it certainly matters to anyone who sits down tries to write a sentence, but that it's it's kind of a both and, that there's this need for a writer to write for some reason, it's a grandmother, or it's something they just heard or said or found out. But yet there's also that, so it's very private, but there's also the public possibility, sort of like when you sit down to write that sentence, there's kind of this in potential for something more to happen. And I think that's the kind of great balance that happens in that, in that privacy of the room. I remember reading somewhere that Saul Bellow wrote to Philip Roth and said, "You and I, Phil, we have the best job in the world because we get to be alone in a room with words." And I think that's where it begins. But then those, the words, a great deal happens with language, and that's, you can't predict that. I think that's been said already. But I try to avoid this essentialism of There's got to be some going out. Maybe not. Maybe nothing. But maybe something.
Thank you for taking the question. So to build actually off of Asim's question, I have again, social justice passion. So my sister tells me all the time that if you want to change the world, just focus on your passion. Because when you focus on your passion, you're gonna instantly be the change for the people around you and do something amazing from that. So out of curiosity, what were your passions growing up, or even now if they've changed besides writing? Because obviously you've changed the world a lot even with your books, but what personally, I guess, inspired you guys in your passions? Thank you.
Excellent. Patricia, did you want to go?
In my case, I was never short on passions growing up. I went through many different phases. I always thought I would be a painter. I thought that would be my ultimate stop. But I wanted to be an oceanographer. I wanted to be a veterinarian, lots of animal-related professions. I wanted to be in the circus. I wanted to be a tennis player, all kinds. And somehow I thought I would write novels on the side. Like I said, every artist I knew had another job, so it never occurred to me that writing could be my only thing. I only came to writing after I had many jobs that I was deeply miserable working at. And I realized that I had to just kind of write seriously to just try to save my own life. But because I'm a practical person, I only gave myself a couple of years to go at it. And it worked out okay. But all those passions have remained, and because through writing I get to discover more passions, and it's a way to live other lives for the sake of research and just, exploring my own imagination. So I think I use writing in that way to remain passionate about life and to meet people, and I become passionate about their lives, and it's a way to build relationships and write friends that I never had, but also make friends that I never had. Just when you write a story and other people read it, then that opens up the door to a new kind of relationship.
Can I answer that one? So I think the only talent I ever had when I was growing up was reading books. That was my only passion, and that's why I went to college and became an English major. But there was really no way I could go home to my parents, who were refugee shopkeepers and who were working 12 to 14-hour days almost every day of the year, and say, you know what, I really want to spend the rest of my life studying romantic poets. And so in order to justify the passion of reading books, I had to find another passion, and that was what you were talking about, this idea that we can change the world in some way. And for me, it was in college was thinking that we need to change stories. Because I grew up, for example, not having stories about people like me, and instead the stories that I encountered, for example, were walking down the block from my parents' grocery store, Vietnamese grocery store, possibly the second one in San Jose, and seeing a sign in another store window that said, "Another American driven out of business by the Vietnamese." And even I knew that there was a story in there, and it's a very powerful story, and it's a story that still exists today, right? And the only way we don't change that story just by becoming doctors and lawyers and engineers and proving how good we are, because no one cares. And we change that story by changing the story, and that's why I became a writer. To say you cannot go out there and put this sign in the store window if I have anything to do about it. I'm gonna write stories so that we can change what it means to be American. We can change what the American story means. And so that's to go back to the question of you over there. I think that's how I justify the work that we do. One of the ways that I justify the work that we do as writers. The art is important, but the politics is important too. The idea that the art can actually change the world, and it has changed the world.
That was excellent. Sadly, that is all the time we have here tonight, but there's another panel tomorrow morning hosted by the brilliant Christopher Cerf, Sinclair, right there. So all the questions we did not get to, save them up for tomorrow. I also want to thank the great panelists here for graciously enduring these questions.